And they are going to present their paper in English, but I have an Italian title, Privatizations in the Middle East and the North part of Africa and European countries, negotiations, cooperation, and fight. I don't know if, tensions, I don't know. I have to decide the title according to your presentation.
Okay, first of all, thank you to the organizer for inviting us in this great occasion, really. We're going to present our cases, which are just outside of the broader Europe, and I will start with a kind of general, broader context and a kind of spoiler, and then we'll pass to Saverio as for the case study. And actually, the aim of our contribution is to set the topic of privatizations of state assets in the Arab countries within the broader context of the development of economic orders in the region of the Middle East and North Africa, and to analyze if and how European policies did play any relevant role. First, let's make it clear that any major privatization of state assets did occur in the period that we've been focusing here. It is between the mid 1980s and early 1990s. The bulk of the privatization in the Arab countries unfolded roughly one decade later, between the late 1990s and all along the 2000s. That's the decade. Almost an era in the fast pace of the latest recent globalizations. And yet our period, the mid-1980s and early 1990s, saw the topic of privatizations being included within the agenda of reforms required by the major foreign partners of the Arab states, namely Western European states, and as well as the European communities. Since these were the champions of the good, I quote, effectiveness and efficiency of the rationales and the workings of the private sectors against the, again, I quote, against the odds, the inefficiencies, if not deficiencies, end quote, of the public sector as they were presented and discussed in multilateral fora like UNCTAD all along the 70s and 80s and the 90s. And it is our idea that it would be interesting to see how states that were engaged in privatizations inside, in Italy, in France, in the UK, how they did act outside, namely if and how did their projects met their policies, their domestic policies, met or not their foreign policies. In the specific case of their neighborhood, their close neighborhood of across the Mediterranean. And the result is, yes, they tried to match domestic with foreign policies, but they did not strike any meaningful success. And at least in the Middle East and North Africa, that at varying degrees continue to hold control of their development path in terms of the time schedule, the extent and the depth of any reforms. And here I will take charge of the boring part of the presentation with a kind of a short timeline of the interactions between economic orders south of the Mediterranean and the role of let's say the posture at least of the Europeans. The 1940s, 1950s saw the end of the colonial European empires throughout the region, which left the space for what the historiography has called the liberal era in the Arab countries. That is where most of the nationalist forces that took control or hold the control of those countries basically were committed liberal as for economics and trade transactions were concerned, wanted to keep the relations with France, with the UK, almost intact, but being treated and traded as sovereign partners. That was the point, the rationale of this. And the liberal economy, for them, was the best framework to act. And the Europeans had to adapt, basically, to this new environment and adopted and championed the liberal economy as the best suited framework in order to redesign, rethink their, and keep their former privileged trade connections and investments in those countries. But then the 1960s were the era of the state-led development, that the era of the first nationalizations, almost committed to the agrarian reforms. The European countries basically left somehow the region in terms of major political commitment. European countries competed among each other in order to retain their trade routes and trade connections with between this shift from private ownership to public ownership of in the Arab productive sectors, even in order to face off the competitions they faced from socialist countries that in that decade inserted very well within this new trend of state-led economy in the Arab countries by gaining access to state expenditure and even by designing the central planning of those countries in many cases. Then the 70s saw another trend unfolding, the oil shocks, and more important than, of course, the oil shocks, the Arab recycling of the revenues out of the export of oil, which meant that 70% went into Western financial banks. A small part was invested domestically, and a pretty significant part, which is the untold story, was recycled within the region. And this recycling of, say, petrodollar or regional recycling petrodollars allowed basically to sustain the chronic deficits of the public sectors in all Arab countries. Chronic deficits that were not a matter of, were not considered at that time by Arab elites as a problem. And not even by the UN experts. That's pretty normal that in the first phases of a state-led development, the state sector does have incur into deficits, but they will resolve them along the time. And here, contrary much to the current literature, critical, let's say, literature on EU-Med relations, arguing that the EU were always liberals, were always neoliberal, neo-colonial, imperial, and the empire is everywhere and always there. But instead, during the 70s, basically, the European communities, by launching a certain set of initiatives, adapted to the request of a state-led economy of the Arab countries. the cooperation agreements or the Mediterranean global policy of the 70s. They all suited very well with the statist economies across in the Arab countries. Basically, the main actors were the state-owned companies, both in Europe and in the Arab countries. And basically, these programs basically oiled, financed, sustained legally and financially bilateral dealings between state-owned companies across the Mediterranean. So Europe has not always been neoliberal or imperial. Then things started to change again and arrived to the 80s, when the revenues of the oil exports started to decline since the early 1980s, then basically fell in with a countershock of 86. So all countries, Arab countries, were left naked in their financial books and had to adapt to what other developing countries were already doing, that is to follow the so-called international debt strategies, because the extent of the public debts of the foreign debts of these countries were exactly the same in terms of proportions to those of Latin America. Exactly the same. With a major difference, however, that all debts there, all foreign debts, were public, were long-term, and they were basically negotiated politically with our other Arab countries, which meant that these had a very regional centered dynamics, and where politics mattered most, and allowed Arab countries to have more margins of maneuver instead of other developing countries in basically facing off their requests by, in particular, financial institutions and namely the IMF, then the Paris Club, that the US since 82, or basically no, since 1917 they began, including privatizations as a request for restructuring debts. The Europeans began including these the requirements, the requests of privatizations only in 1989. Only in as a direct, clear-cut request, 1989. However, in order to match with some of the previous papers, it was in 1985 that they marked a major change from the previous approach. It was, let's say, regional centered. It was a regional policy towards a more standardized approach that placed much stress on the need for Arab countries to adapt to the standards and needs of international competition. Meaning here, you must open up, and your economies, in particular your state sectors, must reform. And here the debate in this particular period of time is centered about the reforms of state-owned companies. And here it would be very interesting, the connections with what we heard today about IRI or the Meridione in Italy, in order to find whether there were some connections, because the debate was there at the very same time. But then, and finally, and I conclude, another event, another quintessentially political event happened, that was the Gulf War. and Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 2 of 1990, and this basically a regional conflict assumed an international let's say quality, was internationalized by the massive intervention and of the US, and many Arab countries saw the opportunity and actually were requested to join the famous Desert Shield operation, and in exchange they asked, and they were granted, the full cancellation of all their foreign debts. That was pretty a novelty, never happened before, for political reason. Political rationale took the upper hand over financial or economics. And this was the case of Egypt and Syria. Other countries would follow through the same rationale. This was the case of Jordan, where they signed in 93 the peace agreement, 94 peace agreement with Israel, and they were cancelled. This meant that all pressures and requests for privatizations and kind of conditionalities were basically left, were derubricated on the agenda, and gave time to the ruling elites in the Arab countries to debate further, to see how other examples were unfolding in Europe, not least in Eastern Europe, and decide the time, space, and extent of the privatization that would happen in 2000. Thank you, and sorry for being late.